Thank you for inviting me to St. Petersburg on this beautiful conference, and thanks to also the other organizers of the conference. In today's presentation, I will talk about the recent uprisings in Turkey, which were known as Gezi protests, but I will more focus on the policing side and try to bring up the issue of states and the police during my presentation. And just to give a short outline of the presentation, I will start with very briefly talking about the state theory, and I will suggest that we should bring the police back in to the states theory discussions, and we should reflect more on police with respect to state theory. And then I will again briefly go over through what happened in Turkey in the last summer 2013. And then I will talk about the policing aspect of the Gezi protest, and I will also try to look at the other side of the shield. I mean, I will try to give a narrative from the police perspective as well. And in the last final section, I'll talk about the situation of the police from a labor perspective in Turkey, and I'll talk about the case of a unrecognized police union, and then conclude my presentation. So in general, I mean, what we know from 1970s, 1980s onwards about state theory was that there was a shift from kind of a Marxist explanation to states towards kind of a state autonomy and institutionalism. Starting with Plansas and then Teras Koçbol and the following, the next generations of scholars started to separate the political from the economy when they tried to understand the states. And then they started look at state institutions and questions actually how institutional design affects preferences of the individuals, and what kind of outcomes does it have, political outcomes does it have. And then, of course, they look at institutions, they look at policies in a comparative historical perspective, and then reach several conclusions. But when it comes to the police as one of the most central institutions of the states, there's a strange kind of shortage of reflection actually about the police in the literature and especially with respect to state theory. And rather we see that studying the police is more or less insulated in the discipline of criminology. And from writings of Clive Emsley or Robert Reiner, we know that there are at least third kind of approaches to what kind of a political role the police have in a society. And the functionalist functionalist approach claims that well, the police actually serve for the maintenance of public order, and it is necessary in our complex societies to have police forces. Whereas the critical approach asserts that the police are essentially repressive in nature because they represent the interest of the ruling classes. And the kind of a more balancing approach differentiates actually different policing tasks, and they argue that there are more political tasks of policing, such as protest policing, for example, and there are less political tasks of policing, maybe such as traffic rules or others. But I think, I mean, especially with the rise of, or with the eruption of global uprisings since 2011, and actually we can also date it back to the global justice movement and then the 9/11 and the framework of war on terror, I think we have to reflect more about the role of the police in the contemporary states, and try to understand it as a state institution, and what kind of how governments and how the state actually influences police politically. And that is why actually the narratives of mobilization and global uprisings should be also studied from the perspective of the state response and how it varies actually across borders. Why in certain countries we see more kind of coercive response, whereas in others we see more permissive response to the uprisings. And what's happening in Turkey in the last summer, to give a brief account. As you all know, I mean, everything started with a small protest against the demolition of a central park in Istanbul, and then it turns into a mass upheaval after the police crackdown on a small number of activists who were camping inside the park, and basically the police force and the municipal security forces set in fire the tents that people settled actually inside the park. And in a few hours actually the protest spread not only in Istanbul but throughout the whole country. And at the end of the first week actually it spread through more than 70 cities, and more than 2 million people were involved in the protests. I guess the pictures, let the pictures speak. Of course, it was also interesting for me to observe the political economy on the streets while the protests were taking place. People were selling gas masks just randomly on the streets. And this one is one picture from Taksim Square. It gives a message to Prime Minister Erdogan saying that, like, greetings to Erdogan, to Tayyip from Taksim. And also interesting for people who frequented Taksim Square throughout their lives was to see barricades constructed around the square, which actually turned the square into some sort of a commune, which was quite unusual for the Turkish Republican history. And that is from the report of a Turkish Medical Association in September 2013, to give you an idea about the scope of the police reaction to the protests. And of course the question is, why did police reacted so coercively? Considering that the protests were essentially quite peaceful. It is true that there were some minor groups who were fighting with the police, especially towards the late hours at night, and there were some violence was involved, at least by some minor groups. But considering the fact that thousands and hundreds of thousands were people involved, and especially at the beginning it was quite peaceful rather than confrontational, the police reaction was repressive on an unprecedented level. And usually, studies on public order policing tell us that, well, you have to also look at the patterns of protests, not only how police is militarized or how repressive the regime is, but you have to look at the patterns of protests. And if the protests are confrontational or riotous in character, then you may expect some tough police response. But in the case of Gezi Park, of course, that was not really the case. The core of the protesters were peaceful, and just by camping inside the park was not really posing a serious public order threat. While the response from the security forces was unproportionally repressive. And they usually, policemen make the distinction between legality and illegality of protests. And in the Turkish legislation, if you think of the public assembly law, the law actually entitles the police to use physical force against a group of protesters that are not, who did not notify the governors, the provincial authorities, prior to the protest. So if the gathering is not authorized, the police have the right to intervene coercively. But according to many actually decisions by the European Court of Human Rights, Turkey was actually charged and found guilty by reacting coercively against protesters who did not notify about their protest, but were essentially peaceful. And the European Court of Human Rights actually says that even though the protest might not be legal, if it's peaceful in its kind of repertoires, governments should show some sort of, at least some level of tolerance. So in that sense, I guess this illegality and illegality issue was not really kind of, it doesn't really explain the situation. And also from my own research, I know that the protests in Turkey are quite institutionalized in the last 20 years. So there is a kind of a rising tendency in terms of the amount of protests that take place in the country, but there is not a really clear sign of getting more riotous, more confrontational. So which brings me to the idea of perhaps the state wants to contain and control contentious activity in the society. Because if you look at the organizational development of the Turkish police in the last 20 years, you will see that it recorded the highest growth in terms of the personnel in the world. And it also is becoming highly militarized in terms of the equipments that are used. So if you compare to the more institutionalizing character of the social protest in the country, then this highly militarized and highly growing police actually doesn't really fit to each other very well. But there's of course another side of the story, which I call the other side of the shield. Most of the policemen who were involved in Gezi mobilizations actually were working up to 80 hours without a break. They were sleeping on the streets or in the parks. Some of them were able to go their homes to sleep, but just in like 2 hours later, at 4 a.m. for example, they were called to come back to the square. And for the lunch menu, for example, they have mustard bread and cheese. And of course, they don't have the right to complain about that. And this was, for example, a regular picture from the protest. And when I was walking from the square to one of the avenues that opens up to the square, I saw chains of buses full of policemen just sleeping. Probably they haven't slept for I don't know how many hours. And to give a kind of a more verbal account of the situation, that was a dialogue between a citizen who was involved in the protest and a policeman. So obviously, the situation is not maybe as black and white as we imagine. So the police reaction was coercive, but also precarious from a labor perspective. And a couple of the policemen I talked to were talking about the fact that some of them wanted to commit suicide because they could not stand it anymore. And that is how actually I want to switch to the last section of the presentation and going beyond the Gezi protests, and that is the unrecognized police union. So basically in Turkey there are no trade union rights for policemen. The international law says that you may, governments may have some restrictions on the right to association and trade union, but in the domestic law it is interpreted as the right to outlaw. So the governments actually should interpret it as in favor of the freedom, but in Turkey it's interpreted in terms of in favor of outlawing that the rights for trade union. So what a couple of policemen did actually 2 years ago, they submitted an appeal to establish their own union, police union, to the administrative authority, to the provincial governorship. And according to law, the governorship should accept the appeal, and if they find something illegal in terms of the content or in terms of the documents, they should ask to the submitters to correct documents. If not, they will go to the court. But what they did was they rejected the appeal and acted as a judicial authority. And in the excuse they said that policemen do not have the right to trade union. So which is obviously, I mean, in the previous slides we were discussing the distinction between legality and illegality. So who is being legal, who is being illegal in this situation? And after the appeal, the founding members of the union were expelled from the job, from the profession, and disciplinary charges were taken against many other members. And the union is still active, but they don't really disclose their names openly because of the high risk of getting expelled or being exposed to disciplinary charges. And basically, I mean, they demand more protection against their superiors and political decisions coming from above. And of course, I mean, you can always blame the rank and file, and that's what they do. If, for example, you see some videos or images of police from beating up the protesters, it's easier to blame the rank and file. And then what you see is actually some investigation is opened against an individual policeman, for example, but who is going to question the orders that come from above, actually, either from the superior officers or from more political authorities. So to conclude, I think the police question is not only a question of the regime, it's a question of the states. And I think we should more and more devote our time to contemplate police as a state institution from the state theory perspective, and perhaps contemplate policing as a government policy. And then we should maybe conduct analysis, comparative case studies or historical analysis with that respect, and then try to link it theoretically to the discussion of the state. And we should think more about what kind of interests, political as well as economic interests, are involved in the institutional design of the police, what kind of relations of power are involved, and we should also think maybe more and again about if a class dimension exists in police as an organization and policing as a practice. Thank you.